Hello everyone. Welcome to the Cyber Vibes channel. In this video, you will learn about the basics of IPv4 addressing in the simplest of explanations out there. This is not a purely technical or complex video, and is recommended to anyone looking for basics of IP. We will be going through the following topics. What is an IP or Internet Protocol? IPv4 addressing, private IP address, public IP address, IP address classes, network and Internet, network address translation or NAT, facts about IP addresses, binary number system, and so on. Let's begin. Most of us would have heard the term IP address, or someone would have asked you what is your IP. Of course yes, because IP address is what makes it possible for you to see this video on the internet right now. In layman's terms, an IP address enables us to communicate with other computers, servers, or any internet-capable device out there. Without this protocol, the internet would have ceased to exist. Yes, you have to believe me, until I take you through the video, where you would get the answers to your questions. You would need at least one IP address to communicate within a network. If you have to go out to the internet, you would need more than one IP address. IP is the Internet Protocol, which is one among those many protocols that exist on the internet. A protocol is just like a defined set of rules. All systems using the defined protocols on the internet should function as per those defined rules. No customizations are allowed. We will have to understand a little bit about the binary number system as well, because it would help us better understand the IP addressing concepts. A computer processor, or the CPU, can understand only two things, 0 or 1, which is processed by the CPU as a digital wave of two different phase or energy states. If you would like to know more about the microprocessor, the secret behind its blazing fast speeds, and the binary language, please view the video dedicated to that on my channel. Have a look at the binary format representation of decimal digits, 1 to 8. The conversion technique is simple: decimal 0 represented by 00, 1 represented by 01, 2 represented by 10, 3 is 11, and so on. Why I am talking about the binary language here, is to make you understand the length of an IP address. IPv4, or IP version 4 addressing format, is what we will be discussing here, which also is the most commonly used and prevalent form of IP addressing currently, even though we have another modern format called IPv6 addressing. IPv4 is a 32-bit address, which means that it has got 32 bits in total. These 32 bits are divided into 4 parts of 8 bits each, separated by a dot between. Each of these is called an octet, namely first octet, second octet, third octet, and fourth octet, in the order from the beginning. If we represent 10.15.250.11 in binary form, it would look like this. The highest decimal number that we can represent using 8 bits is 255, so if IP addressing starts with 0.0.0.0, the last IP in IPv4 addressing possible is 255.255.255.255. In this manner, it is possible to have 2 to the power of 32, that is, 4.3 billion unique IP address combinations in IPv4 addressing. You may be wondering, is it not enough for the internet to survive? It's not. I will explain more about this in some time. There are two kinds of IP addresses when it comes to the routing of IP: the private IP address and public IP address. As the name suggests, the private IP is something that is internal to a local network and is not routable on the internet, but works fine with internet communications. The private IP is owned by none and can be used by anyone. A public IP, on the other hand, is the only IP valid for communication on the internet, and this would be mostly owned by your ISP, or large organizations. Coming back to the 4.3 billion IPv4 addresses. All of these are not available for use. There are many chunks of private address spaces, reserved spaces, and so on, in this 4.3 billion. The approximate number of devices connected to the internet would be more than 20 billion at this moment. IPv4 would have been already out of the race if everyone had a public IP each. We mostly don't need to have a public IP unless we're running an organization providing internet or cloud services. Only the public IP addresses are routable on the internet and are limited in IPv4 addressing. There is an international agency that manages and controls the public IP allocation, that also avoids the conflicts arising due to the scarcity of IP. Moreover, you need to pay a good amount of money in order to own a public IP address. That is why there are private address for us to play around with. Have a look at the table for high-level information of most of the private and reserved address spaces. The reserved IPs would total 588,514,304 addresses. So, out of the 4,294,967,296 IPv4 addresses, if we take out the reserved and private spaces, we will be left with 3,706,452,992 public addresses. Later in this video, I will explain the secret of how 3.7 billion IP caters 20 billion plus devices. If we take into account the technology expansion, we already have crossed the 20 billion mark 3 years ago in 2018. Imagine the number of devices connected to the internet by 2030. By the way, the IPv4 addresses are also divided into 5 classes as you see in the table. Let's talk about the private IP space a bit more. Big organizations usually have the 10.0.0.0 to 10.255.255.255 in their internet or LAN environment, because they can have 16,777,216 IPs to manage their devices internally. The similar way, our home Wi-Fi would be assigning IP from the 192.168.0.x network, because the home router cannot support more than 20 devices at a time, so they don't need to have the larger 10.0.0.0 or 172.16.0.0 pool configured, but that does not stop us from using them on our routers. We can definitely configure it, a little bit of subnetting skills required though. Now, time to reveal the secret behind 3.7 billion public IPs catering to 20 billion plus devices. NAT, or Network Address Translation, yes, the savior of us all, and NAT can be credited for holding the extinction of the IPv4 addressing in a way. It's not just serving the purpose of saving IP addresses, but also provides additional security to the clients on internet while going the internet, by masking their real IP. NAT is also known as PAD or Port Address Translation, which is an interchangeably used term with NAT. Any NAT-capable device like a router, firewall, or proxy, is used by the ISP or large organizations for translation of the private IP to public IP, and these NAT-capable devices do have a NAT table that maps each transaction between the client and server. NAT enables them to use only a few public IPs for all internet transactions. A single public IP can approximately be used to serve 64,000 devices, or requests, simultaneously. I would not be discussing on where the 64,000 came from, or how it works here, because that will make this video more complex. The story of our home Wi-Fi router. Your public IP in this case will be that of the ISP, or internet service provider you are using. Chances are that, if your neighbor is also using the same ISP service, they would also be exiting the ISP's internet router with the same public IP. Most probably a large group of homes in an area under an ISP would have the same public IP assigned. When it comes to our mobile phone internet, over 4G, or 5G, the mobile service provider would be your ISP as well. A group of people connected to a particular mobile tower, or even an adjacent one of the same service provider would have one public IP for all devices connected to that mobile tower using the internet. I would be winding up this video here. I think there is too much information for you to process. But we will meet in part 2 of the IP address, not with these theories, rather more interesting fun aspects and facts of IP addresses, which would have details of how one can trace an IP location without any extra software. Can we hack someone's IP? How can we find our private and public IP? A live cyber attack map of the world, and so on. Stay tuned. Please support the channel by hitting like, sharing the knowledge with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. Enable the bell icon for notifications on the next one.